I had been dreaming about this lake house for years, imagining the mornings I would wake up to the sunlight dancing across the water, the quiet ripples lapping at the shore, and the sense of freedom that only owning a place like this could bring. So when the moving truck finally pulled up and I stepped onto my property for the first time, I felt a rush of pride and relief, as if all the long hours of work, the countless sacrifices, and the months of searching had led to this single perfect moment. But that feeling of triumph was short-lived, because no sooner had I started unloading boxes than I heard the rumble of engines and the harsh screech of brakes on gravel. And when I looked up, I saw a line of identical white trucks parked haphazardly along my driveway, their doors swinging open with a force that suggested the people inside had been waiting for this exact moment. And I knew immediately that trouble had arrived, a knot forming in my stomach as the first figure stepped forward, clipboard in hand and eyes flashing with authority. A woman with sharp features and a haircut that seemed designed to intimidate, and she didn't even introduce herself before she started speaking, demanding to know what I thought I was doing with the docks and the shoreline, explaining in clipped tones that I was violating rules I had never heard of, that the lake itself was under the control of the HO, and that my rights as a homeowner were limited, and I felt my hands go cold as I realized that they had arrived not to welcome me, not to congratulate me on my new home, but to assert power, to intimidate, to make me doubt myself in the first hour of living in a place that I had fought so hard to claim. And yet as I looked at her, her stiff posture, her unwavering glare, and the way the other members of her convoy fanned out across the yard like soldiers, I also felt a flicker of defiance, a quiet spark that reminded me that I had spent months researching every deed, every boundary, every line on the map, and that I was not about to be bullied into giving up what was rightfully mine. But I had to keep my composure, so I smiled politely, nodded, and said nothing as they circled the docks, making notes, pointing, and murmuring to one another with the kind of certainty that comes from believing you are untouchable. While inside I was calculating, remembering every survey, every document I had painstakingly reviewed, and plotting how I would respond when the time came, knowing that reacting too soon could give them an advantage but staying silent too long might embolden them further. And all the while the sun reflected off the water, mocking the tension with its calm beauty, the gentle sound of lapping waves contradicting the storm brewing on my front lawn. And as the minutes stretched, a man with a clipboard approached me directly, his expression hard, his tone sharp, telling me that I needed to remove the temporary dock I had placed for unloading, that I could not use the lake until they had approved my plans, and that I might even face fines if I didn't comply immediately. And I felt a surge of anger mixed with disbelief, because I had verified the permits. I had the deeds, I knew my rights, and yet here they were, standing over me as if my years of hard work and careful planning meant nothing. And I could see in their faces the satisfaction of assuming dominance, the belief that a newcomer could be intimidated into submission. And I clenched my fists, forcing myself to breathe evenly, knowing that losing control of my temper was the last thing I could afford. So I simply nodded again, asked polite questions, and promised to review the rules they were citing, while inside I felt the determination grow. A quiet but burning resolve that I would not only defend my property but also show them that the lake and its docks were mine, that their assumptions about power and ownership were wrong, and that they had made a mistake, underestimating me. And as they finally left my driveway, muttering to each other and glancing back as if expecting me to chase them down or apologize, I stood alone, surveying my property, the lake stretching wide and calm in front of me, feeling the first real sense of both fear and exhilaration, realizing that this was not just a new home. It was the start of a battle I hadn't anticipated, and that every quiet morning, every peaceful sunset, would now be shadowed by the knowledge that the people who claimed to control this community thought they could dictate how I lived. But I was ready to fight that assumption quietly, strategically, and with every right I had, knowing that this moment, standing there with the sun on my shoulders and the water at my feet, was the beginning of a story I would never forget, and that would shape everything I did from that day forward. From the moment they left, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, even though I was alone on my property, and the calm lake that had once promised peace now felt like a stage for an unseen showdown, as if every ripple and shadow reflected the challenge the HOA had thrown down. And I realized quickly that this wasn't going to be a simple matter of waving my deeds and expecting them to back off, because they weren't just enforcing rules. They were enforcing control. A rigid hierarchy in a neighborhood that prided itself on appearances and conformity, And the more I thought about it, the more I saw the layers of tension that could escalate if I wasn't careful. So I spent the rest of the day unpacking with a sense of wariness, noticing how my neighbors across the street peeked through curtains, whispering and exchanging looks that made me wonder if they were loyal to the HOA or just scared of being caught in the crossfire. And when I ventured out to inspect the shoreline, I discovered subtle markers, small signs of old docks, and faded property lines that confirmed what I had suspected but hadn't fully appreciated. My lake rights weren't just a technicality, they were significant, and the HOA had likely assumed I was unaware, assuming that fear or confusion would force me to surrender quietly. And the thought made my stomach tighten because I could already anticipate their next move. The letters, the meetings, the inspectors arriving unannounced, and yet despite the pressure, a thrill of anticipation coursed through me. A mix of fear and the knowledge that I could turn the situation to my advantage, if only I planned carefully and acted decisively. And as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across my yard, I began researching late into the evening, pulling out maps, old county records, and property deeds, tracing lines, measuring distances, and slowly realizing the truth that would change everything. The docks they assumed they controlled actually fell under my ownership, and this wasn't just about property. It was about authority, perception, and who had the right to make decisions on this lake. And the more I dug, the more I saw loopholes, oversights, and assumptions that the HOA had relied on for years, all of which I could now use as leverage, but I knew patience was essential, because revealing my findings too soon could provoke an aggressive response that I wasn't ready for, and I had to consider not only the legality but also the psychology of these people, how their pride and need for control might push them to escalate if they felt cornered. And as I calculated strategies, I also had to manage my own emotions, balancing anger, frustration, and fear with calm reasoning, because any misstep could make me appear vulnerable, and vulnerability here would invite confrontation, scrutiny, and perhaps even false accusations, which the HOA seemed eager to levy against anyone who questioned them. And I realized that while the law might be on my side, winning this quietly would require timing, strategy, and a deep understanding of human behavior, and so I drafted a plan that involved careful documentation, subtle but firm assertion of my rights, and the anticipation of every possible challenge, from verbal confrontations to formal complaints, while simultaneously keeping my neighbors unaware of the full extent of my knowledge, because turning them into allies, or at least keeping them neutral, would be critical if the conflict escalated. And over the next few days, tension grew in ways I hadn't expected, with the HOA sending notices, appearing at random hours, and inspecting docks, trees, and even my garden with a precision that felt almost personal, as if they were testing boundaries, asserting authority, and trying to provoke mistakes. And I responded only with polite questions, careful documentation, and silent observation, taking note of every detail, every misstatement, and every hint of overreach, while secretly marking property lines, taking photos, and compiling evidence that would leave them no room to argue. And yet, even as I prepared my case, the emotional strain was real, because I couldn't ignore the fear that they might find a technicality to exploit, that neighbors might misinterpret my assertiveness as defiance, and that this conflict could drag on longer than I could endure. But every time doubt crept in, I reminded myself of the long journey that brought me here, the countless nights spent researching, saving, and planning, and I refused to let my dream be derailed by intimidation. So I kept moving forward, acting normal on the surface, greeting the occasional neighbor, tending to the lawn, and pretending to enjoy the quiet, while underneath, I was calculating, preparing, and waiting for the right moment to turn the tide. And as the week progressed, the HOA's visits became bolder, their tone sharper, their presence more invasive, and I could feel the undercurrent of aggression in every interaction. Yet I also noticed small cracks in their confidence, subtle hesitations, and inconsistencies that I carefully recorded, knowing that these weaknesses could be exploited without confrontation. And as I stood on the dock one evening, watching the sun set over the water I had fought to claim, I realized that the lake was no longer just a beautiful view or a dream realized. It was a symbol of control, resilience, and strategy, a reminder that owning something meant defending it with knowledge, patience, and unwavering determination. And in that moment, I understood that the tension, the fear, and the uncertainty were all part of a larger game, one that I was ready to play, fully aware that the next confrontation could define the rest of my time here, and that I needed to be both cautious and decisive, balancing emotion with reason, pride with strategy, and above all, maintaining the quiet strength that would allow me to reclaim not only the docks but also the respect and authority that had been challenged the moment the HOA arrived. Because in the end, the lake was mine, and proving it would require every ounce of courage, intelligence, and patience I could summon. The morning the HOA returned, I knew it was going to be different because the tension in the air was almost physical as I watched their trucks roll slowly down the driveway, the engines humming with authority. And this time they came prepared with papers, cameras, and an air of certainty that bordered on arrogance, as if my calm and research over the past week had gone unnoticed and they still believed that fear and rules alone could make me comply. And when the woman with the sharp haircut stepped out first, clipboard in hand, I felt her eyes sizing me up differently, a mixture of irritation and disbelief crossing her face as she realized I was not the easily intimidated newcomer she had expected. And the man beside her began snapping photos of the docks, the shoreline, and even my landscaping, muttering under his breath about violations I didn't see, while I stayed silent, letting them make every mistake, record every assumption, and expose every overreach, knowing that patience would serve me better than confrontation. But the situation escalated faster than I anticipated when one of the inspectors reached toward my dock as if to touch it, to prove some point about ownership, and instinctively, I stepped forward, my voice firm yet measured, telling him to stop, reminding him that the dock was on my property, and that any interference could be considered trespassing, and for the first time, I saw hesitation in their expressions, a crack in their confidence that thrilled me even as my heart raced, because I knew that subtle shift could be leveraged. But then a neighbor emerged from across the street, a middle-aged woman who had always seemed friendly, yet distant, and she interrupted, saying she had called the HOA herself because she believed the docks violated community rules. And suddenly the conflict became layered, personal, and messy, because what had been a battle between rules and rights now included gossip, perception, and alliances I hadn't considered. And as I processed this, the sharp-haired woman stepped closer, her tone icy as she listed violations I supposedly committed while they were waiting for permits and approvals. And every word felt designed to intimidate, to assert dominance, to make me question my own research and judgment. But I refused to flinch, standing tall, reciting my rights, citing property markers, surveying details, and legal documents I had memorized. And with each reference, I saw the frustration grow on their faces, a mixture of annoyance, disbelief, and the realization that I wasn't backing down, that I had evidence they could not ignore. And yet the neighbor's involvement added a new layer of complexity, forcing me to carefully navigate not only legal boundaries but social ones, because I could feel the subtle glances of other residents peering from windows and porches, curious and judgmental. And I understood that every action, every word, every tone mattered, shaping not only the outcome of this conflict but also my reputation in the community, which suddenly felt as precarious as the legal battle itself. And as the confrontation stretched, tempers flared in small but meaningful ways, with one inspector muttering under his breath, one snapping photos a little too aggressively, one taking notes in a way that suggested they expected me to slip, and I remained composed, watching, analyzing, and noting everything for my eventual advantage, while inwardly, my anxiety surged because each move they made carried the risk of escalation, confrontation, or even retaliation, and yet the adrenaline made me sharper, more focused, more determined to reclaim control without sacrificing composure. And just when I thought the encounter had reached a peak, the woman with the clipboard suddenly demanded to see my permits, her voice rising with authority, and I handed her the files I had prepared meticulously over the previous days, watching her eyes widen as she flipped through survey maps, legal boundaries, and ownership documentation, realizing for the first time that my research was thorough and indisputable, and that the docks, the shoreline, and every inch of water access fell within my rightful ownership. And in that moment, I sensed a subtle shift, an unspoken acknowledgement that they had underestimated me. But the victory was complicated by another twist when the middle-aged neighbor whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear that she intended to appeal to the HOA board, claiming favoritism and selective enforcement. And suddenly, what had been a legal and territorial issue was becoming social and political, as if every resident's perception could tip the scales of power. And I understood that asserting my rights alone would not be enough, that I needed to navigate both the rules and the reputations, to show not just legality but fairness, calmness, and undeniable competence. And as the sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the docks and lawns, the confrontation continued with tense exchanges, carefully worded challenges, subtle attempts at intimidation, and the occasional pause where everyone assessed the other's resolve, and I realized that by standing firm, I had shifted the dynamic, transforming from the presumed newcomer into a formidable presence whose knowledge and composure demanded respect. And yet even with this advantage, the emotional strain was intense, because every glare, every clipped tone, every written note carried the weight of a community watching, judging, and waiting for me to falter. And as the day wore on, I felt a mixture of exhilaration and exhaustion, knowing that this was only the beginning, that the HOA would return with strategies, complaints, or new rules designed to challenge me, and that the neighbors' whispered threats added a layer of unpredictability that could either work in my favor or complicate matters. And standing there on my dock, with the water reflecting the late morning sun, I realized that winning this conflict would require more than rights and deeds. It would require strategy, patience, emotional control, and the ability to turn every twist, every challenge, every personal slight into an opportunity. And as I watched them finally pack up and leave, exchanging low words and frustrated gestures, I felt the first true surge of confidence, the knowledge that I had not only defended my property but had begun to assert control over a situation that many would have feared. And I understood that the lake was no longer just a serene body of water. It was now the battleground where intellect, strategy, and determination would define not only my rights but the respect I commanded. And that every wave, every reflection, and every shadow along the shore would now carry the tension, the stakes, and the unspoken story of the day the HOA realized that the person they had tried to intimidate was fully prepared to fight, carefully, calmly, and with every advantage at their disposal, and that the real battle was only beginning, setting the stage for challenges, twists, and confrontations that would test not just my knowledge, but my patience, courage, and ability to claim what was mine with quiet, unshakable authority. The day I decided to take action, everything changed, because I realized that waiting and watching was no longer enough, that the HOA's assumptions, the neighbors' whispers, and the constant scrutiny meant I had to assert not only my legal rights but my presence in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed. And I spent the morning walking the shoreline, measuring distances, checking markers, and reviewing my property survey with a meticulous eye, knowing that every detail I had compiled over weeks would soon be critical. And when the HOA arrived again, larger than before, with more inspectors, cameras, and even one of the board members in a crisp suit, I felt a surge of both fear and determination, because I could see in their confident expressions that they believed the previous encounters had left them in control, that they could intimidate, overwhelm, and perhaps even shame me into compliance. And yet, as they stepped onto my property, barking instructions and citing regulations with the assumption that I would respond with hesitation, I calmly walked forward, holding a stack of documents that represented every survey, deed, and legal boundary I had painstakingly gathered. And I watched the woman with the sharp haircut's eyes narrow as I spread the papers across the dock, pointing to lines, markers, and boundaries that proved not only my ownership of the shoreline but also the very docks they had claimed as theirs. And in that moment, time seemed to stretch, because the confident, assertive stance they had carried for weeks wavered, replaced with disbelief, as if the reality of my preparation and knowledge was impossible to reconcile with their prior assumptions. And just when I thought the confrontation would settle into tense acknowledgement, the neighbor who had been whispering and watching from her porch stepped forward, clearly intent on escalating the situation by challenging my claims in front of the HOA board. But before she could speak, I calmly addressed her, explaining the documentation, the measurements, and the legal precedents in a way that left no room for argument. And I could see the shift immediately in the board member's expression, a subtle nod, a recognition that despite the social pressures, the facts were undeniable, that I had turned every assumption against them, and that the lake and its docks were legally and indisputably mine. And then something unexpected happened, a twist that no one had anticipated, because as I spoke, pointing to the survey markers and recounting the history of ownership, one of the inspectors stepped back, visibly unsettled, muttering under his breath as he realized that the docks he had been photographing and inspecting were technically on my property line. A revelation that seemed to crack the group's collective confidence. And in that instant, the woman with the sharp haircut, usually so commanding, faltered for the first time. Her voice sharp but uncertain as she asked questions, trying to regain control but failing to hide the disbelief, and as she shuffled through her papers, glancing repeatedly at the survey I had laid out, I felt a surge of quiet triumph, because the power dynamic had shifted in my favor. The authority they had wielded so confidently was now in question, and I could sense the tension radiating from them, an invisible weight that made every glance, every gesture, every word measured, because they were no longer certain, no longer dominant, and the realization that their assumptions about me had been wrong seemed to hang in the air like a storm ready to break, while I remained calm, collected and unyielding, aware that this was the moment that could define not only my ownership but also my standing in the neighborhood. And then, just as I thought the turning point was complete, the neighbor stepped forward again, her expression a mixture of anger and awe, and she asked a question, one meant to undermine me, about the legality of a certain dock placement that I had anticipated, and with precise calm, I answered, citing county regulations, prior approvals, and the documented property lines, and as I spoke, I could see heads nodding subtly among the HOA members, a shift in acknowledgement that the facts were on my side, and that their attempts at intimidation, social pressure, and assumed dominance had failed. And then the most shocking moment came when the board member, who had been silent for most of the encounter, spoke up, not in anger but in cautious respect, admitting that my documentation was thorough, my property lines accurate, and that legally I had every right to the docks. And as those words sank in, a wave of relief and exhilaration washed over me, because the conflict that had seemed endless, personal, and overwhelming had reached a pivotal turning point, and yet the stakes had never been higher, because now the social dynamic had shifted. The neighbors' whispers were tinged with both respect and envy, and the HOA, though unwilling to openly concede, had been forced into a position of reluctant acknowledgement, knowing that any further aggressive move could backfire publicly. And as I watched them gather their papers, muttering quietly and exchanging cautious glances, I realized that this moment was not just a legal victory, it was a psychological one, a dramatic turning point where patience, preparation, and composure had transformed fear and intimidation into undeniable authority. And as I finally stepped back, surveying the lake, the docks, and the property that was unequivocally mine, I understood that the battle had changed, that the next steps would be about strategy, alliances, and maintaining control, and that the lake, which had once been a symbol of serenity and dreams, was now also a stage for power, courage, and the realization that sometimes, standing firm, armed with knowledge and quiet determination, could shift the entire dynamic in ways no one expected, leaving me both exhausted and exhilarated, knowing that this turning point had not only preserved my property but also set the stage for the next phase of the conflict, one that would test my ability to defend, assert, and ultimately claim not just the lake but the respect and recognition I had earned through unwavering resolve. The day the confrontation reached its peak, I could feel the weight of anticipation pressing down on me the moment the HOA trucks rolled onto my driveway, larger than ever, with more officials, more cameras, and an intensity one hadn't yet experienced. And this time, they came not just with rules but with what looked like a coordinated plan to overwhelm me, expecting that the sheer presence of authority would force me into submission. But as they approached, clipboard in hand and voices clipped and commanding, I felt a surge of clarity and focus, a calm determination that replaced the earlier tension, and I knew that this was the moment everything I had prepared for would either succeed or be tested like never before. And as the woman with the sharp haircut strode toward me, her eyes blazing with impatience and assumed control, I laid out my documentation, pointing to every survey line, every deed, every historical record that proved beyond doubt that I owned not just the shoreline but the docks and the access points that they had been claiming. And for the first few minutes, the air was electric, charged with disbelief and subtle hostility, as they shuffled papers, whispered to each other, and attempted to interject with rules and clauses that I had anticipated and refuted silently in my mind for weeks. And then the tension snapped when one of the inspectors, a man I hadn't noticed before, boldly stepped onto the dock, reaching toward the railing as if to assert physical dominance, and instinctively, I stepped forward, voice steady but firm, telling him to step back and reminding him that he was trespassing on private property. And the silence that followed was profound, because suddenly, the theoretical dispute became physical, tangible, and immediate, and I could feel my heart pounding as I realized the stakes had escalated beyond documents and words into territory, where confidence, courage, and presence mattered more than legality. And then, without warning, the neighbor who had been hovering nearby, the one who had whispered complaints before, called out loudly that she had spoken to the HOA board and that I was violating community standards, her tone accusatory and sharp, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of panic because the social pressure had intensified, but I forced myself to take a deep breath, centering on the facts, on the meticulous research I had done, and on the undeniable truth that every dock, every foot of shoreline, and every inch of access was mine. And as I responded calmly, showing the survey maps, the property markers, and the deeds, I saw the disbelief and frustration ripple across the group, the board member glancing at me in subtle acknowledgement, realizing that their assumptions and plans were unraveling before them, and the climactic moment arrived when the woman with the sharp haircut, her voice rising in a mix of anger and shock, demanded that I cease all activity immediately and threatened fines and citations. And in that instant, I made a choice, standing taller, voice unwavering, pointing to the documented boundaries and stating clearly that any action against me would be a legal violation. And as the words left my mouth, the tension was almost unbearable, a charged silence that seemed to suspend time, because for the first time, authority and intimidation collided with truth and preparation in a way that no one could ignore, and then a subtle but profound shift occurred. As heads turned toward each other, whispered discussions began, and even the neighbor who had tried to escalate the situation fell silent, realizing that the factual, calm presentation I had made left no room for her claims. And in that charged moment, I felt a mixture of triumph, relief, and exhaustion, knowing that the climax had arrived and that the power dynamic had finally shifted in my favor. Yet I also knew the fallout would be complex because the HOA could not openly admit defeat. Social perceptions could still sway. Opinions and lingering tensions among neighbors could spark future challenges. And as the minutes stretched, they began to pack up, muttering, consulting among themselves, and taking extra photos as if to document my compliance even though the truth was undeniable. And I stood there, watching, noting every detail, feeling a quiet sense of victory tempered by the awareness that this was not the end but a turning point, because I had not only defended my property but asserted control, forced acknowledgement, and demonstrated calm authority in the face of intimidation. And the immediate aftermath was a mix of relief, whispered conversations, cautious glances from neighbors, and the realization that the social landscape of the community had shifted subtly but permanently, with me now recognized not just as a homeowner but as someone who could hold their ground, whose preparation, patience, and courage had turned fear and aggression into respect and acknowledgement. And as the sun reflected off the lake that afternoon, casting long golden streaks across the water and the docks that were mine, I felt the full weight of the moment, the exhaustion of vigilance, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the climax had been survived, the confrontation had been won, and the lake, once a dream, had become a testament to strategy, persistence, and the courage to stand firm when everything seemed against you. And even as I began the process of putting things back in order, organizing my docks, and reclaiming the serenity I had envisioned, I knew that this day would linger in memory, not just for the victory, but for the emotional intensity, the lessons learned about people, power, and patience, and the undeniable truth that sometimes asserting what is yours requires a mix of preparation, courage, and timing so precise that it transforms confrontation into triumph, leaving a mark that could never be erased from both the property and the perception of those who once sought to intimidate you. After the storm of confrontation finally passed, a strange calm settled over the lake, the water glinting softly in the late afternoon sun, and I realized for the first time that I could breathe fully, not just because the docks and shoreline were secure, but because the invisible tension that had weighed on me for weeks had lifted, though the lessons and emotions lingered like a quiet echo, shaping not only my perspective but the dynamics of the neighborhood in ways I hadn't anticipated, because suddenly, the HOA members who had arrived with such confidence now approached with cautious politeness, their sharp tones replaced with measured words, and while none of them openly admitted defeat, there was a subtle acknowledgement in their eyes, a recognition that I had been prepared, firm, and unshakable in a way that commanded respect. And as I watched them leave for the final time that day, I felt a mixture of relief, triumph, and an almost surreal disbelief at how dramatically a few weeks of tension could reshape a place I had thought would simply be peaceful. And the neighbors, too, began to shift, with some approaching me quietly, apologizing for earlier whispers, others asking questions about the property, the rules, and how I had handled the situation. And I realized that while the battle had been about docks and lakes, it had also been about perception, courage, and the power of calm persistence. And as I greeted them, explaining small portions of the research and planning that had guided me, I felt an unexpected sense of connection forming. A subtle change in the community where respect replaced fear, curiosity replaced judgment, and even those who had once doubted me seemed to recognize the quiet strength required to stand firm. And in those moments, the lake itself felt transformed, not just a body of water but a symbol of patience, strategy, and the ability to protect what is yours without surrendering dignity or composure. And as the sun set, casting long golden reflections across the docks I now fully controlled, I walked along the shoreline, observing the subtle details. The way the reeds swayed gently, the light glimmered on the surface, the birds moving across the sky, and felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond legal ownership, because I had proven something to myself as much as to anyone else, that preparation, focus, and quiet determination could turn intimidation into respect and confrontation into victory. And as I organized the final touches on my property, adjusting ropes, aligning docks, and inspecting markers, I realized that my connection to this place had deepened, that every struggle had heightened my appreciation for the beauty and value of the lake, and that the social landscape had shifted in a way that allowed me not just to protect my rights, but to cultivate a sense of community rooted in fairness, respect, and understanding. And over the following days, as neighbors waved, exchanged small smiles, and occasionally stopped to ask advice or share a quiet conversation, I recognized that relationships had been quietly recalibrated, that those who had once wielded authority through intimidation now approached with civility, and that the power I held was not just legal, but emotional, social, and symbolic, affirming the principle that standing firm with knowledge and calm confidence could shape interactions far beyond the initial conflict. And as I sipped coffee on the dock one early morning, the mist rising from the water and the world still and peaceful, I reflected on the journey, on the fear, tension, and adrenaline that had dominated the past weeks, and I felt pride in my composure, satisfaction in the planning that had guided me, and gratitude for the clarity and focus that had allowed me to navigate not just the laws of property but the unspoken rules of perception, reputation, and community. And I understood that the lake was now a part of me, a living reminder of patience, courage, and the quiet victories that shape our lives in ways no one can fully anticipate. And as the day warmed, and the gentle sound of the water lapping against the docks filled the air, I realized that the resolution was more than a legal triumph. It was an emotional and personal one, a confirmation that confidence and preparation can turn intimidation into opportunity, that standing firm can redefine relationships, and that even in the face of aggressive opposition, calm persistence can create outcomes that are not only just but deeply satisfying. And while I knew that life would continue with small challenges and occasional disagreements, the lake, the docks, and the shoreline were secure, my reputation strengthened, and my connection to the community and to myself had been transformed, leaving me with a sense of peace, empowerment, and the quiet knowledge that I had faced fear, confrontation, and social scrutiny, and emerged not just victorious but profoundly changed, with the lake reflecting not only the light of the sun but the clarity, resilience, and calm strength I had discovered within myself, a place where I could finally rest, reflect, and appreciate the full measure of what it meant to claim, protect, and honor what is yours, leaving a lingering sense of triumph and contemplation as I watched the water shimmer in the fading light, knowing that every ripple carried the story of persistence, courage, and the quiet power of standing unwavering in the face of challenge. Weeks had passed since the confrontation that had defined the early days of living by the lake, and in that time, life had begun to settle into a rhythm that felt both familiar and transformed, because the docks I had fought for were no longer just structures of wood and rope. They were symbols of resilience, patience, and the quiet strength that had carried me through days of fear, uncertainty, and tension. And as I walked along the shoreline each morning, the soft lapping of water against the posts reminded me of every moment I had spent preparing, measuring, documenting, and standing firm against authority that had assumed they could intimidate me. And in the calm light of dawn, I often reflected on how much those first weeks had changed me, revealing strengths I hadn't fully known I possessed and teaching lessons that went far beyond property lines. Because I realized that courage is not always loud or aggressive. It is deliberate, thoughtful, and rooted in knowledge, and that true power comes from understanding both the facts and the people around you, anticipating their moves, and responding with calm decisiveness. And in the neighborhood, the aftermath of the conflict had rippled outward in subtle but meaningful ways, as neighbors who had once whispered and observed from a distance now approached with cautious respect, asking questions about the docks, the water, and the property. And even those who had supported the HOA's assumptions now seemed more open to conversation, to understanding, and to seeing that authority must sometimes be met with calm challenge and well-prepared reasoning. And in these interactions, I discovered a new dimension of connection, a sense of community built not on fear or control but on mutual recognition of boundaries, fairness, and respect. And as the sun rose higher, glinting off the lake's surface, I also reflected on my own internal growth, how the anxiety, tension, and fear I had felt were transformed into clarity, confidence, and a quiet satisfaction, because the struggle had forced me to confront my limits, my patience, and my ability to maintain composure under scrutiny. And I realized that in claiming what was rightfully mine, I had also reclaimed a sense of self-trust, a belief in my ability to navigate challenges both expected and unforeseen. And the lake, once merely a beautiful setting for a dream, had become a living teacher, showing me that persistence, preparation, and calm resolve can shift even the most entrenched dynamics, and that victory is not always about confrontation, but about timing, insight, and the courage to stand firm when others expect submission. And as I tended to my property, adjusting ropes on the dock, watching birds skim the water, and listening to the soft ripple of waves, I understood that every detail mattered, every choice had consequences, and every moment of calm observation had prepared me for the moments of storm, because life, like the lake, carries both stillness and turbulence, and navigating both requires presence, awareness, and trust in oneself. And looking back, I could see how fear and intimidation had been transformed into a narrative of empowerment, how each tense interaction had become a lesson in patience and strategy, and how even the challenges that seemed overwhelming in the moment were opportunities to discover strength and resilience I hadn't recognized before. And as the neighborhood slowly adjusted, the HOA tempered its approach, learning, perhaps grudgingly, that authority must be balanced with knowledge and fairness, while I felt a renewed sense of ownership not only of the land and water but of the way I carried myself, of the calm authority I had learned to wield in the face of pressure. And in this long reflection, I realized something profound about life beyond property disputes, that confidence built on preparation, calm observation, and measured action can ripple into every part of one's life, shaping relationships, perception, and self-trust in ways that endure far beyond the immediate conflict. And as the days turned into weeks and the lake mirrored every sunrise and sunset with quiet constancy, I felt gratitude for the journey, for the fear that had pushed me to grow, for the tension that had sharpened my focus, and for the triumph that had shown me the depth of my own resilience. And I understood finally that this story was not just about a lake or docks, but about standing firm in the face of doubt and challenge, about turning intimidation into respect, and about recognizing that the greatest victories often come not from force, but from patience, knowledge, and the courage to uphold what is rightfully yours. And as I watched the light dance across the water one evening, with the breeze carrying the subtle scent of the shore and the quiet of the community around me, I felt a profound sense of closure, knowing that the lake would remain a sanctuary, a teacher, and a testament to the power of quiet perseverance, and that the lessons learned here would guide me in every future challenge, reminding me always that strength is forged in calm resolve, respect is earned through knowledge and courage, and that sometimes the most dramatic transformations in life happen not in loud battles, but in the quiet confidence of standing unwavering, trusting yourself, and claiming the space, the respect, and the life that you are meant to have, leaving a lingering sense of triumph, reflection, and enduring empowerment that will echo in every ripple on the water and every peaceful moment on the shore for years to come.